Orillia's waterfront today is dominated by the Port of Orillia and recreational parkland. When originally surveyed in the early 1800s, the shoreline was much further inland than it is today. The waterfront was reshaped with infill and reclamation so that railways could be built where there was once water. First the Midland Railway in 1873, and later the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1912. By the early 1870s, boat building was a prominent feature on the waterfront. This map illustrates the waterfront after 1873 and indicates shoreline before and after the Midland Railway. Don Hunter's scrapbook, part of the local history collection at the Orillia Public Library, quotes J.R. Hill's recollections of the earliest boat builders on Orillia's waterfront. Joseph Carley was the first registered boat manufacturer in Orillia. Carley was located at the foot of Coldwater Road at Lakefront and relocated after the railway to the new shoreline in 1873. Carley was in business building canoes and small craft in Orillia from 1860 to 1876. A few years after that, the family moved to Barrie, where they continued to build boats near the foot of Bayfield Street until the 1960s. Fred John Delaney started operations in 1870. Location was near the waterfront at the bottom of Mississauga Street on the south side. Delaney produced boats, skiffs, yachts, canoes, and was also an agent for Ontario Canoe and Peterborough Canoe. Delaney purchased Huntley Boat Livery in 1873 on the lakefront at Coldwater Road. Delaney Boat Works continued until 1899. George N. Black produced pump boats. A pump boat is an outrigger canoe powered by a small gasoline or diesel engine. Smaller pump boats might be powered by the sort of single-cylinder small engine used to drive a water pump. He was located at the foot of Mississauga Street on the north side in 1885. Thomas Bridgewater purchased George Black in 1888 and then Delaney's Boathouse in 1895. John Dean started making canoes on Orillia's waterfront in 1870. John died in 1894 and Mrs. Dean continued operations until 1942. Dean produced boats, canoes, skiffs, and paddles. John's son Walter moved to Toronto in 1883 and became quite famous for building torpedo racing canoes at Sunnyside. This ad from a boating magazine in 1916 shows the Sunnyside torpedo at the center. These boats were very successful, with orders coming from all over the world. Even today, Walter Dean canoes are revered. This is an online ad for 2016 for a Walter Dean t-shirt on the Canadian Canoe Museum website. The description is as follows. Creator of the famous Sunnyside Cruiser, the Klondike Sectional Canoe, and the Sunnyside Torpedo, Walter Dean was born in England in 1864 and came to Orillia, Ontario with his family before the age of 2. At the age of 19, he went to Toronto to work with Harry F. Hodson, a builder of skiffs and other light craft. In 1888, he was well enough established to open the High Park Boathouse at Sunnyside on the western outskirts of the city. For 35 years, he designed and built boats of many kinds and made a special reputation for fast racing canoes. The brilliant autumn maple leaf was amongst the most distinctive of the trademarks used by Canada's old-time canoe builders. As documented by Bud Trivett in his work entitled Holiday Steamers, a part of the local history collection at the Orillia Public Library, between 1885 and 1905, 4 steamships ranging in size from 70 to 116 feet are known to have been built at the waterfront in Orillia. The Queen of the Isles in 1885, the Orillia also in 1885, later christened the Islay, the Longford in 1887, and the Geneva in 1905. By the time Orillia was involved in steamship building, the railway had already arrived, and the principal use of these vessels was, from the outset, pleasure cruising, with the exception of the Longford, which was used as a working boat early in her life before the railway reached Longford. Prior to 1885, however, steamships built in other locations played an important role in transport to Orillia. Steamers were applicable, and in season, were a much quicker and easier option to stagecoaches. The earliest steamer to offer service to Orillia was the Sir John Colborne, built in 1832. Had a 90-foot length, 18-foot beam, and with a 10-foot draft, passage through the Narrows was not an option, so the earliest port of Orillia was actually on Lake Simcoe at Shingle Bay. Water skiing was not an option either, with a top speed of 4 miles per hour. The steamer picked up wood at Islay while doing rounds on Lake Simcoe. Within a year or two, newer steamers with less draft and more speed, 7 to 8 foot draft, 10 to 18 miles per hour, started shooting through the Narrows to arrive at Orillia's waterfront on Lake Couchiching. By 1836, there was a government dock at the northeast corner of Mississauga and Front Streets, where the Champlain Hotel now stands. Early steamers running the Narrows appear to have damaged or at least helped bury the weirs. There were numerous incidents due to shallow water, involving getting stuck in the silt and the mud. The Narrows was first dredged in 1856-1857. This picture shows the first steamship built in Orillia, the Queen of the Isles, under construction in 1885. At 75 feet, the Queen of the Isles looked like a large tug, even though she was designed to serve as a pleasure boat. She was generally considered to be the most luxurious tug on the lakes. Service on Lakes Couchiching and Simcoe started in 1885. Queen of the Isles was taken to Lake Muskoka in 1892, where she was finally scrapped near Bracebridge in 1938. These newspaper ads for the Queen of the Isles show her providing service on Lake Couchiching in 1886 and service on Lakes Couchiching and Simcoe in 1888. In 1885, Captain Charles McGuinness bought Strawberry Island on Lake Simcoe and built a hotel, cottages, and picnic grounds there. The same year he built the boat Orillia to carry passengers to his island. Original length of the boat was 85 feet with a beam of 18 feet. In 1894, the boat was rebuilt and rechristened the Islay. The Islay was 116 feet, with a capacity for 300 passengers. The Islay operated until 1914, when she was beached at Couchiching Beach Park and used as a skating hut. The SS Longford was unique amongst Orillia-built steamers, due to the fact that, even though she was originally conceived as a pleasure craft, she spent much of her working life in hard service. David L. Sanson had started transporting goods and people around Lake Couchiching with the steamer Orillia in 1870. When the Orillia burned in 1885, he set out to replace her with an Orillia-built steamer. The new steamer was to be named the St. Clair, but after the hull had been laid and machinery purchased, Sanson ran into financial constraints that prevented completion of the project. Lumber baron William Thompson purchased the incomplete vessel and completed her as the SS Longford in 1887. The SS Longford was a rather stubby 85 feet in length with 16-foot beam. William Thompson's father, John, had purchased the entirety of Longford Township on the east side of Lake Couchiching for $30,000 in 1867. Their extensive logging of the area grew to be one of the largest lumber operations in Simcoe County, cutting 10 to 20 million board feet per season. The SS Longford was put to work initially as a towing scow, hauling 15 by 20 foot scows piled high with lumber to the railhead at Orillia. For many years after the Northern Railway was extended up the east side of Lake Couchiching, reaching Longford Mills in 1875, Thompson continued to tow his lumber to Orillia, somewhat at a stubbornness. He had refused to transfer his business to the Northern Railway until they finally sent senior executives to negotiate terms with him at his office in Longford Mills in 1890s. Once the Northern Railway was used to ship Thompson's lumber scows to Orillia were no longer necessary, and the SS Longford's primary role was changed. She was basically kept in service as a lower-cost alternative to other passenger steamers at the time, and was available for hire for just about any task. The ship was worked hard for 20 years until 1905, when, with persistent leaks, unreliable engines, and rotten her hull, she was unceremoniously abandoned on the shores of Garnet Island on Lake Couchiching. In 1905, Thompson replaced the Longford with the 70-foot steamer Geneva, also built in Orillia. She is the one hull you can still see from the shore, lying alongside her berth at Longford Mills, from which she sailed until 1930, making her the last of the lake steamers. The J. H. Ross Boat and Canoe Company appeared on Orillia's lakefront in 1890. The first Ross building was near the Delaney Boat Company and was a busy enterprise right from the beginning. Steamboats were gradually losing out to the railways in the 1890s, and roads and highways were opening up new territory throughout Ontario. This was the era of the expanding summer home construction on Kawartha Lakes, Lake Simcoe and Couchiching, Sparrow Lake, and the Muskoka Lakes. It was an ideal time for small boat building industry. Not only was John Harry Ross a good boat builder, he was also an accomplished paddler, sculler, and sailor, which no doubt contributed to his boat building skills. He improved the designs for sculling skiffs, sailing skiffs, racing canoes, and motorboats in the early 1900s. In particular, he built a new type of sailing skiff in the 1890s called the Nautilus, which is pictured above to the left. The Nautilus was a 22-foot, twin-masted, gaff-rigged craft with bat-wing sails. She was carvel planked with copper rivets fastening to oak ribs, providing a smooth and sturdy hull. This type of construction proved to be much faster than the conventional lapstreak sailing skiffs of the day. The Nautilus won just about all races of her class locally, as well as many on Lake Simcoe and at the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto. The design was a forerunner to dinghies and sloops built later in the early 1900s. Ross built war canoes accommodating 15 paddlers for racing early in the 1900s. They also built extra-large canoes for the Hudson's Bay Company and for surveyors of the Grand Trunk Railway. Business continued to expand. In 1906, Ross built a new boat plant on the south side of Mississauga Street with 80-foot frontage. The new plant allowed building a much larger craft, and by 1908 they had built their first motor launch. Pictured here is one of the first Ross motorboats from 1908. Pictured in this ad from Motor Boating Magazine in 1911 is a Ross 20-mile 30-footer. The caption reads, "The J.H. Ross Boat and Canoe Company, Orillia, Ontario, builders of hunting, fishing, sailing, and surveying canoes, motorboats, skiffs, and dinghies, call their 30-foot by 5-foot 6-inch motorboat their most characteristic model." Advertisements in magazines from the early 1900s invited readers to write for a catalogue. Some idea of the scope of their products is provided in the pages of this catalogue from 1914. At the end of the catalogue, this picture of a successful hunt camp. If you were setting out for this type of adventure, you obviously needed a J.H. Ross canoe. An ad from 1923 proclaims that Ross builds high-class motorboats and canoes. Notice how readers were invited to write in for a catalogue. The Weekly Times reported on August 20, 1908, that the company had built a 21-foot motor launch for Jake Gilgadar, the famous sculler, for his boat livery at the Narrows. 2 years later, Ross built a 23-foot motor launch for Jake's brother Charles, and a 30-foot motorboat for James B. Tudhope. The Weekly Times reported July 20, 1923, that the Ross Company had built the Rossway 3 with a new hull design for greater speed. This was a V-bottom, 32-foot long boat with a 7-foot beam and carvel planking with 3/4-inch mahogany. With a 100-horsepower engine, this craft was capable of reaching 30 miles per hour, and it is said that this was one of the Ross boats that distinguished itself at the Canadian National Exhibition. As a result, orders were received for a number of motor launches, sailing craft, and yachts from distinguished people throughout Canada and the United States. When the CPR was built along Orillia's waterfront in 1912, the Ross building at the waterfront was demolished, and the company was provided with new waterfront facilities. The company continued to build its larger craft at its building on Mississauga Street until the death of J. Harry Ross in 1934. Allen Ross, the eldest son, carried on the business until 1964 when fire destroyed their boathouse. In 1912, the waterfront was again changed to accommodate a railway. This time it was the CPR who were required to replace all of the demolished buildings. Once again, existing boathouses were removed and new ones built. In 1899, three Rolland brothers, Frank, Harold, and Jack, and their families moved to Orillia from Gananoque, Ontario. This picture shows the original Palace boat livery before the CPR railway, from which they rented canoes, motorboats, and sailboats. Frank and Jack Rolland built the Helena in 1910 to carry passengers on Lake Couchiching. Pictured here is Frank Rolland. In 1912, the CPR built a new railway along the waterfront. The shoreline had to be filled and extended, and the existing boathouses were removed, including Palace boat livery. In 1914, the new Rolland Palace boat livery was built close to the new town wharf at the bottom of Mississauga Street. From this new livery, Frank Rolland continued to rent rowboats and canoes. In 1918, a new motor launch named Huronic was built for Rolland by Gidley Boatworks in Penetang. Huronic was used for transporting supplies as well as passenger excursions. With tourism expanding in the Orillia area, Rolland began providing sightseeing tours around Lake Couchiching and down the Severn River to Sparrow Lake. Frank Rolland retired in 1930 and the livery was taken over by Frank's son Harold. In 1933, Harold replaced the Huronic with the Miss Orillia, capable of carrying 30 passengers. The Miss Orillia was built in Orillia by Hunter Boats. Harold Rolland continued to guide fishing parties around the lake, including the Leacock brothers, Stephen, George, and Charlie. The business continued to expand until a disaster struck on April 14, 1964. A serious fire destroyed the J.H. Ross Boat and Canoe Company located next door and demolished half of the Rolland Boathouse, as well as Miss Orillia. In 1966, Rolland Boats moved to a new location on Highway 11, 3 miles north of Orillia. Harold's sons, John and Neil, continued to sell and service the marine industry until October 1987 when it was sold, ending close to 100 years of participation in the boat business for the Rolland family. Pictured here is a concept drawing for a typical Ditchburn cruiser from 1924. This image and other materials on the history of Ditchburn Boats is published online by Harold Shield at a website entitled Ditchburn Boats, a Muskoka Legacy, online at ditchburn.ca. The Ditchburn name has been associated with boat building for literally centuries. William Ditchburn served as a naval advisor to Queen Elizabeth at the time of the Spanish Armada in 1588. In 1869, 4 Ditchburn descendants, brothers William, Henry, John, and Arthur, emigrated to Canada, settling in the village of Rosso, which was then on the pioneer frontier of Canada. When the resort industry in Muskoka began to flourish, the Ditchburn brothers turned to the family tradition of boat building. Recognizing that the newfound tourism industry would require boats to ply the lakes, the Ditchburns began to construct rowboats from the upper story of William's house, close to Pratt's Hotel in Rosso. In 1874, Ditchburns boasted a livery fleet of 24 rowboats that were rented out to visitors. After close to 20 years of building small craft at Rosso, the Ditchburns, with Henry in charge, moved operations to Gravenhurst in 1890, where much more traffic passed through. The newly formed 8th Ditchburn Company built its yards at the Muskoka Wharf area, where all trains bound for Muskoka arrived, and from which all steamers bound for the lakes departed. The first powerboats were produced around 1898. By 1904, Henry was aging rapidly and he handed over control of the boatyard to his nephew Herbert. A new company was formed in 1907, with directors being Herbert Ditchburn, Henry's nephew Alfred Ditchburn, and master boat builder Thomas Trivett. The company built mainly 16 to 45-foot specially ordered launches with very high-quality workmanship. A fire consumed this factory in 1915, but it was immediately rebuilt with a brick building at the same site. One of the first boats to be built at the new brick plant was the Kawandag II, a 73-foot yacht built for John Eaton and designed by Bowes and Moore. Constructed entirely of mahogany, the Kawandag II was the first large ship built by Ditchburn and set a standard that many other boat builders looked up to. In addition to exceptional quality large ships, Ditchburn was acclaimed for building very fast runabouts. In 1920, Harold Greening of Hamilton, Ontario, commissioned Ditchburn to build the Rainbow I, forerunner to a series of 11 Rainbows, 7 of which raced for Canada internationally. In the picture above, the caption reads, Holding the place of honor in the Sterling engine display at the 1920 New York Boat Show, Rainbow 1 was acclaimed Best Runabout Ever Built. The growing reputation of Ditchburn Boat Company, the stunning success of 2 large vessels built for the Eaton family, the surprising achievements in racing, and the growing population of summer residents in Muskoka began to overwhelm the Gravenhurst operation. By 1923, orders were coming from much further afield: Montreal, New York, Western Canada. On December 4, 1924, the Orillia Times carried exciting news that the Ditchburn Pleasure Boat Company Limited of Gravenhurst had decided to build a new boat factory at the waterfront on Lake Couchiching. Mayor McLean and other City of Orillia officials moved quickly to secure the land lease and institute dredging operations to provide 15-foot water depth for a distance of 200 feet out onto the Lake Couchiching waterfront. Orillia's location on the Trent-Severn Waterway provided access to expanded markets. This picture from 1928 shows a Ditchburn made in Orillia for C. Kilgore. Note that the Couchiching Beach Pavilion is visible in the background on the left. Ditchburn's success was unprecedented. The customer list was like a veritable who's who of wealthy Canadian and American owners. The Toronto Star Weekly in January 1928 carried a 2-page tribute to Herbert Ditchburn that ended, "It is a story of success from the start, and so much of the success consists of something born in the blood and the breed, something instinctive and unteachable, like the ability to sing supremely, the gift of making planks and metal blossom into ships." The 1929 crash dealt a death blow to Ditchburn. Orders quickly ran dry. By 1930, layoffs were necessary. In August 1930, Thomas Trivett resigned from the company and eventually formed Trivett Boat Works. The only significant work for the winter of 1931 was at the Orillia factory, the 85-foot Graysand II, pictured above, and a 117-foot patrol boat for the federal government. Delivery of the Graysand II was to Lake of the Woods, a very interesting story indeed, and fully documented on the website ditchburnboats.ca. On May 26, 1932, Ditchburn Boat Limited was declared bankrupt and all operations at Orillia ceased. A year later in Gravenhurst, it was reorganized as Ditchburn Boat and Yachting Company, and a line of smaller boats, 18 to 24 foot, were introduced, but the Depression prevailed. One last reorganization occurred in 1936 as Ditchburn Boat and Aircraft Limited, but this last attempt ended in bankruptcy in March 1938. The Graysand II is the largest Ditchburn still afloat. Out of the Ditchburn ashes in Orillia rose a new boat builder remembered as Hunter Boats. Its story is told by Donald A. Hunter, one of the principals. When Ditchburn went into receivership, Alistair P. Hunter, Ditchburn's superintendent of construction, bought the buildings. Alistair Hunter had been building interesting new design things pretty well all his life. He became supervisor of motors for Ditchburn, moving to Orillia from Halliburton in 1929. Throughout the Great Depression, his ingenuity kept boat building alive here, building canvas canoes, and then hiring Bert Hawker, a former boat designer for Herb Ditchburn. Together, they designed and built craft well known in these parts. Pictured here is Miss Mariposa, a Hunter streamliner. The picture is published by Thomas DeWald at the website hunterboats.ca. As mentioned earlier, in 1933, Harold Rolland commissioned Hunter Boats in Orillia to build a new 30-passenger sightseeing cruiser, and it was named Miss Orillia. The new cruiser was a great success, and in 1938 another Hunter boat was added to the fleet. Throughout this period, Hunter Boats built a number of sizable craft for well-to-do clientele, and also 26-foot sport fishing boats, as well as conducting storage, service, and boat repair. In 1939, when the Canadian government began to gear up for the war effort, nobody was more ready than Orillia's Hunter Boats. It began with conversion of a 58-foot pleasure craft donated by Colonel Blackstock of Toronto into a fighting patrol craft for the Canadian Navy, which at the time had 6 river-class destroyers and perhaps 20 other boats, including all harbor craft. A number of contracts for small vessels followed, culminating in the construction of a number of 112-foot fast-motor patrol boats of a class called Fairmiles. For the rest of the war, Hunter Boats worked on Navy, Army, and Air Force boats of various specifications, while continuing to build Fairmiles, 2 at a time, in the excellent facilities acquired from Ditchburn. In 1941, the staff grew from 6 to 125 people. They incorporated as Hunter Boats Limited, with Alistair Hunter as president and Don Hunter as vice president. They led the Fairmile Parade to produce a fast, efficient, and capable small patrol craft to take the place of corvettes in patrolling entrances to Canadian harbors, as lacking destroyers to do the convoy work, and without capacity to build destroyers, Canada had no recourse but to press the corvettes into convoy duty, however inadequate they were for the job. Hunter also built pontoons for the Army to use to support temporary bridges in the advance across Europe. Pressing ahead with construction of Fairmiles, it was often necessary for Hunter to create patterns for underwater fittings. Hunter engaged Glenn Mallory of Gravenhurst as superintendent of construction. Meetings of plant managers from 8 other yards were held frequently to speed production. The Ontario Fairmile Association was formed, cutting red tape in construction of the 59 Ontario-built Fairmiles. Hunter's was the first Fairmile launched in Canada, number Q060, on September 10, 1941. She was the only Fairmile ever given a name. She was christened Mariposa Belle and is featured in the picture above. In total, Hunter produced 7 Fairmiles. Following the end of the Second World War, the Hunter Boat Company returned to building wooden pleasure craft. As a result of the declining popularity of wooden boats, the company was sold in 1976. The Hunter Boat Building was the last remnant of Orillia's boat-building heritage on the waterfront until it burned in 1993. This historic plaque at the waterfront in Orillia has been erected near the site of Hunter Boats. It recounts the explosion of the last Fairmile while it was being built in Orillia in October 1943 that killed 1 man and injured 6 others. On a calm day, footings from old docks can be seen on the lake bed just offshore. In this picture we see the historic plaque, and in the background the 2016 in-water boat show at the port of Orillia. Orillia's waterfront has throughout its history provided a reflection of its major industries, first lumber, then manufacturing, and more recently tourism and recreation.